She stood at her own mailbox on a Tuesday morning in October, holding an envelope that didn't make sense, a credit card, her name, $23,000 she had never spent. Inside her house, the man she had married was still asleep. Inside her bank account, $61,000 she had saved over 30 years had quietly become $4,000, and she had no idea when it happened or how long it had been going on or how deep the damage went. She had built everything in that house with her own hands, her own sacrifice, her own stubborn refusal to give up, and somewhere between I do and this Tuesday morning, it had all been taken. What happened next? She never saw coming. The morning light came through the kitchen window the way it always did in late October in Sarasota, soft and golden, filtered through the sea grape trees that Margaret Eleanor Caldwell had planted herself 12 years ago. Back when the house on Pelican Cove Lane was nothing more than a bare lot with a cracked concrete driveway and the stubborn promise of something better. Margaret, Maggie, to everyone who loved her, stood at the counter with her coffee mug pressed between both palms, watching the light move across the tile floor she had chosen herself. Piece by piece, from a sample book at the flooring store on Tamiami Trail, warm and uneven, the kind that looked like it belonged in a Tuscan farmhouse. The salesman had tried to talk her into something more neutral, more practical. She had smiled politely and pointed at the terracotta anyway. That had always been her way. She was 58 years old, and every single thing in that house, the tiles, the sea grape trees, the hand-painted cabinet knobs she had ordered from a woman in New Mexico, the small but thriving catering business that operated out of the commercial kitchen she had built in the back was something she had chosen, worked for, and paid for herself. Not inherited, not gifted, earned. Her story wasn't dramatic in the way people expected stories to be dramatic. There was no single catastrophe that had launched her. No lottery win that had helped her along. Just decades of quiet, relentless work. Beginning when she was 19 years old and had moved to Sarasota from Gainesville with $200 in a savings account, a car that overheated on the highway, and a determination so bone-deep it sometimes frightened her. She had worked as a waitress at a beachfront restaurant on Siesta Key through her 20s, saving every dollar she didn't absolutely need, learning the food business from the inside out. She had taken accounting classes at night at the community college, not because she loved numbers, but because she understood even then that ignorance about money was a luxury she couldn't afford. In her early 30s, she had married a kind man named Paul Caldwell, a contractor from Bradenton who had loved her fiercely and helped her believe, for the first time, that wanting good things for yourself wasn't the same as being greedy. Paul had died of a heart attack at 44 a Tuesday morning in February on a job site in Venice. He was there one day, and then he wasn't. Maggie had grieved in the way strong women often grieve, completely and mostly alone, and without letting it stop her. She had her daughter, Claire, who was 11 at the time and needed her mother to keep standing. She had the small catering company she had launched the previous year, Maggie's Table, which specialized in events for retirement communities and private parties across Sarasota County. And she had the house on Pelican Cove Lane, which she and Paul had bought together and which she had made the quiet, sunlit center of her world. For 15 years after Paul died, Maggie had raised Claire, grown the business, paid off the mortgage, and built a retirement account that she checked every month with the kind of careful, almost reverent attention that some people gave to prayer. She wasn't wealthy. She was stable. She had made herself stable, the way you make a wall stable, not all at once, but brick by brick, in the right order, making sure each layer was solid before adding the next. Claire was grown now, living in Atlanta with her husband and 2 kids. They talked every Sunday. Maggie was proud of her in a way that was almost physical, a warmth that spread through her chest when she thought about it too long. And then there was Dennis. She met Dennis Whitfield at a charity gala for the Sarasota Art Museum in the spring of her 54th year. He was 61, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate in Orlando, polished in the way of men who had spent their lives in boardrooms and client dinners, good suits, easy conversation. The kind of confidence that fills a room without being aggressive about it. He had laughed at her joke about the past appetizers being underwhelming for the price of the ticket. She had liked his laugh. It was genuine, or it had seemed genuine. They had dated for 14 months. He was attentive, patient, and unlike some of the men she had encountered in her years of cautious, infrequent dating, genuinely interested in what she had built. He would ask about Maggie's table with what seemed like real curiosity, wanting to understand the logistics, the margins, the seasonal patterns of the catering business. He told her she was remarkable. He said it often enough, and with enough apparent sincerity, that she had eventually let herself believe it. They had married at the Sarasota Botanical Gardens on a Saturday in April, 2 years ago now. 60 guests. Claire had been the maid of honor. The terracotta tiles in the kitchen had been warm underfoot when they came home that evening, and Maggie had thought, standing in the doorway with her shoes in her hand and Dennis's arm around her shoulder, "I have done something good." She had thought that for 18 months. She sipped her coffee and looked at the morning light on the terracotta floor and tried to remember exactly when the feeling had started to change. It was hard to pinpoint. That was the thing about the way it had happened. It hadn't arrived all at once, the way a storm arrives. It had arrived the way rot arrives in old wood, slowly, invisibly, from the inside. The first small thing had been so small that she had filed it away and forgotten it almost immediately. 6 months into the marriage, she had gone looking for the folder where she kept the business insurance documents, a green hanging folder in the second drawer of her office desk, where it had lived for 11 years. It wasn't there. She had found it eventually in a different drawer, in a different order. She had assumed she had misplaced it herself. The second small thing had been a phone call she had walked in on. Dennis in the backyard, by the bougainvillea, speaking in a low, tight voice that stopped when he heard the sliding glass door open. He had turned, smiled, said it was a former colleague having a hard time. She had believed him, because why wouldn't she? The third small thing had been a credit card statement that arrived in the mail, a card she hadn't known existed, in her name with a balance she didn't recognize. She had stood at the mailbox on Pelican Cove Lane, holding that envelope, and felt something cold move through her that she hadn't been able to name yet. Something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Something older and quieter than both. She had gone inside and made coffee and set the envelope on the counter and looked at the morning light on the terracotta floor and tried to think clearly. That had been 3 weeks ago. This morning, the envelope was no longer on the counter. She had opened it. She had made calls, and the thing she had felt at the mailbox, that cold, nameless thing, had a name now. She set down her coffee mug and reached for her phone. The name of the woman at the bank was Patricia, and she had the particular kind of careful professionalism that Maggie associated with people who delivered bad news regularly and had learned to do it without showing anything on their face. "Senora Whitfield," Patricia said, folding her hands on the desk in the small private office off the main floor of the Sarasota branch of First Coastal Bank. "What I'm going to show you today is information you have a right to access as a joint account holder. I want you to have the full picture." Maggie had called the bank that morning, the day after she had finally, with shaking hands, opened their credit card statement and then spent 2 hours on hold with their credit card company before reaching a human being who confirmed that yes, the account had been opened 18 months ago, and yes, it was in her name, and yes, the address of record was the house on Pelican Cove Lane. The balance was $23,400. She had written that number on a notepad by the phone in her careful, even handwriting and stared at it for a long time. Now Patricia was sliding a printed statement across the desk, and Maggie was looking at it. And the number at the bottom of the page was $4,217. "This is the joint savings account, Patricia Said, the one you and your husband opened together 14 months ago." 14 months ago, Maggie repeated. The balance was $61,000. "Jeff?" Maggie looked at the withdrawals, listed in neat rows going back over a year. Most of them were under $3,000, a threshold she recognized from her accounting classes 30 years ago. As the amount below which transactions typically didn't trigger automatic flags, whoever had made those withdrawals had known that. Can you tell me who authorized these withdrawals? The account has two authorized signatories, Patricia Sa. Either account holder can make withdrawals without the other's signature. Maggie nodded slowly. She had known that, technically, when you marry someone after a lifetime of managing your own finances, you make certain assumptions about what trust looks like in practice. You don't stand at a bank counter imagining that the person you have just married will spend the next year quietly moving your money somewhere else in amounts just small enough not to attract attention. Unless you have reason to. She hadn't had reason to, or she had told herself she hadn't. Patricia, she said, keeping her voice level, I also need to ask about a business account. Maggie's Table LLC. Account number. She read the number from a slip of paper she had brought with her. Patricia typed for a moment. Her expression didn't change, but something in her stillness told Maggie what was coming before the words did. That account currently has a balance of $842. The business account, the account that's at the last statement Maggie had personally reviewed 8 months ago, before Dennis had quietly taken over what he called the administrative side of the business to take some of the load off her shoulders, had held just under $30,000, the operating reserve she had spent 3 years building. The buffer that meant she could pay her staff and her vendors and her insurance even in January and February, when the catering calendar went quiet. $842. Maggie sat very still. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, through the tinted bank window, a palm tree shifted in the Gulf breeze. She thought about the moment 4 months ago when Dennis had suggested she give him secondary authorization on the business account. It just makes sense. Mags, I have a financial background. Let me help you run this more efficiently. She had thought, at the time, that it was a loving gesture. The kind of thing a partner did. She thought about the new truck in the driveway, which Dennis had said he was making payments on. She thought about the 3-day trip to Miami he had taken in August, which he had said was a golf trip with old colleagues. She thought about the credit card in her name with $23,400 on it, and the savings account with $4,217 left in it, and the business account with $842 in it. She did the math. She was good at math. I'm going to need copies of everything, she said. She drove home slowly, the folder of bank statements on the passenger seat. The Sarasota afternoon was brilliant and in different sunshine on the bay. Tourists on the Ringling Bridge, IBC's walking the median of Tamiami if they on the road. She called her closest friend before she reached the driveway. Lorraine Beauchamp had been Maggie's friend for 22 years, since they had met at a homeowners association meeting for their neighborhood and discovered, over terrible iced tea in a community rec room, that they were both widows who had built their own lives and had no patience for people who pitied them for it. Lorraine was 63, a retired schoolteacher from Bradenton, and she had a gift for saying true things plainly and without cruelty. He's been draining the accounts, Maggie said, not crying. She wasn't crying yet. For over a year, the savings, the business account, there's a credit card I didn't know about with $23,000 on it, in my name. A long pause. Where is he right now? Lorraine asked. I don't know. He left this morning before I was up. Said he had a meeting. Maggie? Lorraine's voice was careful. Don't confront him tonight. Not without knowing more. Do you hear me? I'm hear coming you. Over. Maggie sat in the driveway for a moment after she hung up, looking at the house. The sea grape trees, the painted mailbox, the front garden she had planted by hand the first spring she lived here, impatiens and bird of paradise and 2 small palms that had grown, over 12 years, into something substantial. She thought about the credit card statement and about the word that had been forming in the back of her mind all morning. The word she hadn't quite wanted to allow herself to think directly. Fraud. And under it, quieter and more devastating, I let this happen. She wouldn't let that thought stay? Not yet. There would be time for all of it. The accounting of what she had missed and why, the inventory of every small thing she had explained away. But first, she needed to know the full extent of it. She needed to know everything. She got out of the car, squared her shoulders, and went inside. Dennis came home at 7 that evening. She had spent the intervening hours at her kitchen table with Lorraine and the folder of bank statements, going through everything methodically. By the time she heard his key in the lock, she had added up the numbers 3 times and reached the same total each time. Over $64,000 gone from accounts she had built over decades, plus the $23,400 in debt on a card she hadn't known existed. In total, a loss of nearly $90,000. She had also found, in the accordion file she kept in the office closet, the one Dennis had reorganized 6 months ago, that the title to a small rental property she had owned in Northport, a 2-bedroom house she had bought as an investment 7 years before she met Dennis, had been refinanced. She hadn't authorized a refi. She hadn't signed any documents, but her signature was on the documents. It was not her signature. She sat at the kitchen table when Dennis walked in, hands flat on the surface, the folder closed in front of her. He came into the kitchen smiling, loosening his tie. "Hey, sweetheart. Long day, is there?" He stopped when he saw her face. "Mags, what's wrong?" She looked at her husband, the easy confidence, the good sweet, the familiar smile, and felt something in her chest shift and settle, like something that had been off balance for a very long time, finally finding the floor. "Sit down, Dennis," she said. "We need to talk." The conversation lasted 3 hours. It was not a shouting match. Maggie had decided, sometime during those hours at the kitchen table with Lorraine and the bank statements, that she would not shout. Not because she wasn't furious. She was furious, in a way that felt geological, slow-moving and total, but because she understood, with a clarity she hadn't possessed during the softer, easier years of their marriage, that Dennis was a man who operated on emotion, who used emotion as a tool. And she was not going to give him any more tools. She had laid the statements on the table, one by one, and watched his face. He had denied, at first, a misunderstanding. A temporary loan he had taken from the accounts to cover a business deal he'd been working on, something he'd meant to tell her about when the timing was right. She had listened without expression and laid the next document on the table. He had shifted, then, to explanation. The business deal had gone badly. He had been embarrassed to tell her. He had meant to put everything back before she noticed. She laid the document showing the refinanced title of the Northport property on the table. That was when his face changed. There was a moment she would remember it for the rest of her life, when she saw him calculate, not feel, calculate. She watched it happen behind his eyes. A rapid internal accounting of what she knew and what she could prove and what story could still be made to hold, she thought. I have been watching him do this our entire marriage and mistaking it for thinking. That refinance? He said finally, slowly. That was something we discussed. You agreed to it. I never agreed to it. That's not my signature, Dennis. Maggie. You're misremembering. You were dealing with the holiday season bookings. It was a lot stop. Her voice was quiet and absolute. I know what my signature looks like. I have been signing my name for 58 years. That is not my signature. He was silent. How much? She asked. What? The refinance on the Northport property. How much did you take? He looked at the table. 80,000. She had known it was significant, but the number landed on her chest like something physical. $80,000, stripped from a property she had owned for 7 years, that she had maintained and rented and managed as part of her retirement plan. Equity she had spent years building. She sat very still and breathed. Where is it? She asked. Most of it is gone. The deal. What deal? He said the name of a real estate investment company she had never heard of. He said the names of two partners she had never heard of. He described a commercial development project in Cape Coral that he said had collapsed due to permitting issues. She wrote down every name, every detail, in the notepad she had kept beside her throughout the conversation. By the end of the third hour, she had a rough accounting of what he had taken and where he claimed it had gone. She didn't believe all of it. She suspected some of the money had gone to places he wasn't naming, debts she didn't know about, perhaps a life she hadn't been fully allowed to see. But she had enough to know the scope. After Dennis went to bed, she had told him she needed space, and he had, to her exhausted relief, retreated without argument. She sat alone at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with her notepad and her calculator. The total loss, when she added everything together, was approximately $167,000. She was 58 years old. She had $4,217 in joint savings, $842 in her business account, $23,400 in credit card debt she hadn't incurred, a mortgage on a house that was still in her name, a business she might not be able to make payroll for in 3 weeks, and a rental property that now carried a debt she hadn't authorized. She was not going to cry at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. She made a list instead. At the top, she wrote, attorney, then new bank accounts, separate, then forensic accountant, then lock on office door, then call Claire. She looked at the last one for a long time before she made herself write it. The call with Claire was not easy. Maggie had driven to Lido Beach early the following morning before Dennis woke up and sat in her car in the parking lot with the Gulf of Mexico in front of her, broad and silver in the early light, and called her daughter. Claire's first response was rage, clean and immediate and protective, the way her daughter's emotions had always been, undisguised and Mom, how long? How did he? I never trusted him. I should have said something. I should have Claire. Maggie kept her voice steady. This is not your responsibility. None of this is your fault. It's not your fault either. I know. A pause. Do you really know that? Or are you just saying it? Maggie looked at the Gulf. A brown pelican coasted low over the water, enormous and improbable looking and completely confident in its direction. I'm working on it, she said. That was honest, because there was a voice she wasn't going to pretend there wasn't, that had been running beneath everything else since she opened that credit card statement. A voice that catalogued every moment she hadn't paid closer attention. Every time she had handed something over for the sake of ease or trust or the relief of not having to manage absolutely everything alone. It was a precise and merciless voice, and it knew exactly which levers to pull. You are 60 years old. You just lost $167,000. You built this for 30 years and you let it be taken in 18 months. What does that make you? She knew the voice wasn't telling the truth. She knew, intellectually, that what Dennis had done was deliberate and systematic and predatory, and that it had been designed to be invisible. Lorraine had said it clearly. The night before, this is what they do. They find women who have things, and they take them. This is not carelessness. This is who he is. Knowing that didn't make the voice quiet, but it kept the voice from being the only voice. I need a good attorney, she told Claire. Do you know anyone? I'll ask around today. Don't tell anyone else yet. Not until I know what I'm dealing with. Okay, Mom. A pause. Are you safe? Maggie considered the question. Dennis wasn't a violent man. She had never felt physically afraid of him. What he was, she was beginning to understand, was something more surgical than that. He was a man who had looked at her life and identified every place where she could be accessed, and had entered through those places quietly and methodically, using her own trust as a key. I'm safe, she said. I'm angry. Good, Claire said. Stay angry. The attorney's name was Susan Park, and her office was on Main Street in downtown Sarasota, on the 3rd floor of a building that looked out over the bay. She was 52 years old, sharp-featured, with the direct manner of someone who had spent decades watching people arrive in her office with their lives in pieces and had learned that what they needed was not sympathy but strategy. Maggie had called her on the Wednesday morning, the day after her conversation with Claire. She had the meeting by Friday afternoon. She brought the folder, the bank statements, the credit card documents, the photocopies she had made of the refinancing paperwork, the notepad with Dennis's accounting of where the money had gone, and a timeline she had spent 2 evenings constructing every financial event she could document in chronological order from the day Dennis had first been given access to her accounts. Susan Park read through the documents for 12 minutes without speaking. Maggie sat across from her and watched the bay. Senora! Whitfield, Susan said finally, setting down the last page. What you're describing is not just a breach of marital trust. Depending on how the forgery on the property documents can be substantiated, this could constitute multiple counts of financial fraud, forgery, and possibly wire fraud if any electronic transfers were involved. That's what I thought, Maggie said. You've been very thorough. Susan gestured at the timeline. This is good. This is the kind of documentation that makes a difference. I was an accountant student for 2 semesters in 1989, Maggie said. It turns out that's enough. Susan almost smiled. I'm going to refer you to a forensic accountant who works with our firm. She can trace the withdrawals, look for patterns, and potentially identify where the money went, which matters both for any criminal charges and for asset recovery in the divorce proceedings. I want to pursue both. I assumed you would? Susan set down her pen. I want to be honest with you. Recovery is possible but not guaranteed if he has moved the money in ways that are difficult to trace, or if he has transferred assets to third parties. The practical recovery may be less than the legal judgment. But I also want you to understand that what he did was a crime, and there is a legal process available to you. I understand. How are you holding up? It was a practical question, not a therapeutic one. Maggie appreciated that. I'm functioning, she said. The business needs to make payroll in 11 days, and I have $800 in the operating account. That's the most immediate problem. Do you have personal assets you can use to bridge the gap? I have a personal savings account he didn't have access to. It was a small account, something I'd kept separate since before we married. Force of habit. Sit? I almost gave him access to it twice, he asked. Both times I said I'd get around to it. Susan Park looked at her with an expression that was professional and precise and contained at its edges something that might have been admiration. That account may be what keeps your business alive through this. I'd recommend moving whatever payroll you need immediately, before he has any indication that legal proceedings are beginning. Maggie nodded. She had already done it that morning. She filed for divorce on a Monday. Dennis was served the papers at the house on a Wednesday afternoon. While Maggie was at a bridal shower, she was catering at a private club on Longboat. 40 women celebrating someone's daughter, passing elegant small plates through a sun-drenched event room, the Gulf glittering beyond the windows. She stood in the commercial kitchen at the back of the club, watching her staff Renata, who had worked with her for 7 years, and Marcus, who had been with her for 4, and 2 part-time servers whose steady reliability she had never appreciated as much as she did right now, and felt, alongside everything else, a fierce and specific gratitude. These people had come to work because they trusted that she would make payroll. She had made payroll. She was going to keep making payroll. She thought about the version of herself that Dennis had tried to create, the version that was confused, dependent, embarrassed, too ashamed of her own oversight to act decisively. She had seen him trying to build that version in small moments over the past 18 months. The gentle corrections when she spoke about the business, the quiet suggestions that she was tired, that she was overwhelmed, that it was a lot for one person to manage, that he could help, that she should let him help. He had been very good at it. He had been patient and consistent and attentive, the way you are attentive to something you are carefully taking apart. She had almost become that version of herself. She had gone further down that road than she wanted to admit. She hadn't gone far enough. Her phone buzzed with a text from Susan Park Paper Serbet. His attorney will be in touch. She put the phone in her apron pocket, picked up a tray of hors d'oeuvres, walked out into the sunlit event room, and smiled at 40 women she didn't know. The deposition took place 6 weeks later, in Susan Park's conference room on the 3rd floor of the Main Street building, with the bay still visible through the window and the October light coming in clean and direct. Dennis arrived with his attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who specialized in asset protection and who had the manner of someone very comfortable with finding edges in the law. Dennis himself was dressed carefully, composed, and Maggie noted with a clarity that no longer surprised her performing. That was the word that had settled in her mind over the past weeks. As she had reconstructed their marriage from the outside, the way you reconstruct a crime scene after the fact. Not the relationship. A performance. She had been cast, without her knowledge, in a role in someone else's production. The hard-working, trusting wife whose assets made an attractive backdrop for someone else's plans. The forensic accountant Susan had hired, a meticulous woman named Dr. Vivian Cole, had spent 4 weeks tracing every transaction. Her report, which Maggie had read 3 times, documented $167,400 in assets moved from accounts Maggie had built. It also documented, in careful detail, that $41,000 of the money from the Northport property refinance had been transferred to a personal account in Dennis's name only, a fact he had not mentioned during their kitchen table conversation. When he had described the entire $80,000 as having gone to the failed Cape Coral investment, that discrepant y menos $41,000 that had gone somewhere he hadn't told her about was what made the difference between a civil divorce proceeding and a criminal referral. When Susan Park set Dr. Cole's report on the conference table and opened it to the page documenting that transfer, Dennis looked at it for a long moment. His composure didn't shatter. He was too practiced for that. But something went out of it, the way the light goes out of a room when a cloud passes over the sun. Gerald Foss leaned over and spoke quietly to his client. Dennis looked at Maggie for the first time since they had entered the room. She met his eyes and held them and thought, "You made a mistake. You thought I was something you could take apart. You were wrong about what I was made of." She didn't say it. She didn't need to. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February, 5 months after Maggie had stood at the mailbox on Pelican Cove Lane holding a credit card statement with someone else's debt on it. She was in Susan Park's office when the paperwork came through. Lorraine was with her because Lorraine had been with her for every significant moment of the past 5 months. At the kitchen table with the bank statements. In the parking lot on Lido Beach, when Maggie had needed to sit quietly by the water for an hour before she could face the house again. In the waiting room outside Dr. Cole's office. In the car outside the courthouse on the morning of the first hearing. "That's it," Susan said, setting down the signed documents. "It's done." Maggie looked at the papers. Her name alone. Margaret Eleanor Caldwell, reverting to her name from her first marriage, the name she had been when she was building things, when she was learning what she was made of. The settlement had not recovered everything. That was the truth that Susan had told her plainly from the beginning, and that Maggie had made herself accept. Not everything would come back. The $41,000 traced to Dennis's private account had been ordered returned in full, plus interest. The credit card debt in her name had been ruled as liability and would be discharged from the marital estate. The business account would be compensated from the settlement to the amount of $22,000. The remaining losses, money that had gone to the Cape Coral investment, money that had genuinely vanished, were less recoverable. In total, she would get back approximately $80,000 of the $167,400 that had been taken. It was not everything. It was not nothing. It was enough to stabilize Maggie's stable through the slow season, enough to rebuild the operating reserve to a functional level, enough to begin again from somewhere solid instead of from ruble. The criminal referral for the forged signature on the Northport refinancing documents was a separate matter. Still proceeding through the Sarasota County State Attorney's Office, Maggie had submitted every document she had. She had given her statement. She had done what she could do, and she had released the rest to the process. "How are you feeling?" Susan asked. And this time, it was not entirely a professional question. Maggie thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said. "Grateful." Lighter than I expected, she looked at Lorraine, who was holding a small paper cup of coffee from the waiting room machine and watching her with an expression that was warm and steady and entirely without pity. "Lighter?" Lorraine said. "I think I've been carrying the weight of what I didn't know for the last 2 years," Maggie said slowly. "Not just the last 5 months, the not knowing. That's its own kind of weight. Knowing is hard, but it's a different kind of hard." She had made changes in those 5 months that went beyond the legal and financial. She had taken back the administrative management of Maggie's table completely and immediately. New accounts, new passwords, new systems that only she controlled. She had raised her prices slightly but deliberately, because Dr. Cole had reviewed her business records and noted, almost in passing, that Maggie had been undercharging for years. She had hired a part-time bookkeeper, a young woman named Andrea from Osprey, who was studying accounting at State College of Florida, and who reminded Maggie, in her careful attention to numbers and her quiet confidence of herself She had also, and this had taken longer than the financial changes, and hurt more in a different way, done something she had been avoiding. She had gone back through the marriage honestly and identified every moment she had handed something over. Not to torture herself, but to understand, because if she couldn't understand how it had happened, she couldn't trust herself going forward. And trusting herself, her own judgment, her own perceptions, her own reading of what was true, was the thing she needed most. What she found, when she looked honestly, was not stupidity. That had been her fear, that she would look back and find that she had been obviously, embarrassingly foolish. But that wasn't what she found. What she found was something more specific and more human. She had been lonely. Paul had been gone for 15 years. She had done everything herself for 15 years, and she had been proud of that. And she had been exhausted by it. And when Dennis had appeared attentive and capable and apparently solid, she had, in small moments, allowed herself to be relieved. That relief was what he had used. Not her stupidity. Her humanity. She sat with that for a while. It didn't make her feel better immediately, but it made her feel true, which was better than better. On a Saturday morning in late March, Maggie drove to Lido Beach alone and walked down to the water in the early morning before the crowds arrived. The beach was pale and quiet, the Gulf laying itself down on the sand in long, even sighs. A few sandpipers worked the shoreline. The air smelled like salt and cut grass and the particular sweetness that only comes from being close to the water when the day is still new. She had a catering event that afternoon, a retirement party for a woman named a 72-year-old former librarian whose book club friends had planned a surprise lunch at a home on Siesta Key. 40 guests seated service. A menu that Maggie had designed herself around Greta's favorites, shrimp and grits, Gulf grouper, key lime tarts, the size of silver dollars. She had something she had not had 6 months ago, standing at the mailbox with the credit card statement in her hand. She had not had it 1 year ago, watching Dennis make quiet phone calls in the backyard by the Bugatti. She had not had it 2 years ago, standing in the doorway of her house on her wedding night with her shoes in her hand, thinking she had done something good. What she had now was clarity. Not happiness. Happiness was a different project, and she was working on it. The way she worked on everything, systematically, honestly, without pretending it was simpler than it was. But clarity, the knowledge of what she had, what she had built, what had been taken and what had been recovered, and what she was capable of. The knowledge that she had faced the hardest thing she had ever faced since Paul died, and she had not gone under. She thought about Claire, who called every Sunday and sometimes more, who had flown down in November and spent a week helping her mother sort through paperwork and eat real meals and occasionally cry in the kitchen without explanation or apology. She thought about Lorraine, who had never once suggested that Maggie should have seen it coming, who had instead sat across from her at the kitchen table with her sleeves rolled up and helped her figure out what to do next. She thought about Renata and Marcus, who had asked no questions and just kept showing up, and about Andrea, the bookkeeper, who checked the accounts every Tuesday with a reliability that made Maggie feel, for the first time in a long time, that she wasn't the only person watching. She thought about the house on Pelican Cove Lane, which was still hers. The mortgage was still manageable. The settlement had given her enough to keep it that way. The terracotta tiles were still warm underfoot in the morning. The sea grape trees she had planted 12 years ago were still there, broader now, better established, their roots gone deeper than they had been. You build slowly and you lose quickly. And then, if you are the kind of person who knows how to lay bricks in the right order, you build again. She had done it once from almost nothing. She could do it again from something. The Gulf moved against the sand. A pelican coasted overhead, banking easy and low on the warm Florida air. Maggie Caldwell stood at the edge of the water and let the sun hit her face and thought about shrimp and grits and key lime tarts and the long, specific, uncomplicated pleasure of arriving at someone's party and making the food exactly right. Then she turned around and walked back to her car and went to work. There is no map for the kind of betrayal that comes from the person standing closest to you. There is no warning label on love. What there is what Maggie found, and what is available to anyone willing to be honest enough and patient enough to look for it. Is this? The knowledge of what you have built does not leave you when someone tries to take it. The skills, the judgments, the capacity to begin again, those belong to you in a way that a bank account never can. They cannot be refinanced without your signature. They cannot be moved to a private account while you aren't watching. They are yours. They always were.